welcome back to the Wolves of K Street podcast. We've got about 50,000 followers so far, so the podcast seems to be doing great. Today we're going to talk about two things, both involving the Federal Trade Commission. In the news right now is a big case involving the FTC challenging President Trump's powers over the executive branch. So we figure it's a great point to go back to an early section in our book where we discuss a different challenge to the FTC's authority. This one led by Tommy Boggs and corporate America back in 1978, I believe it was. So Luke, set the stage for us. This is 1950s, 1960s. Companies have very little influence in Washington. The government is growing. All sorts of new federal powers, and rules and regulations for business. And then we really focus on this FTC case. But give us the background there.
Yeah. Right. So, in the mid 1970s, late 60s, mid 1970s, businesses are really on the defensive in Washington. The corporate lobbying establishment is very weak, sort of disjointed.
There is no corporate lobbying establishment.
Correct. Yeah. All of the energy is on either side of unions, consumer protection organizations. They're really the ones that are innovating with strategies. All of the momentum is on the side of sort of regulating the excesses of corporate capitalism that developed after the 1950s, right? So, businesses in Washington really sort of are confused. They don't know what to do. They don't even know if they should be fighting back, right? Because there's so much.
And then we got the Powell memo.
Well, right. That's what I was going to mention. The Powell memo, which I believe was written in 1973, was kind of a reflection of how the corporate lobbying establishment sort of felt at that time. And basically, it was written by a former it was written by a former U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Powell, and basically he was basically saying, like, look, free enterprise in America is on the menu right now, right? Like we're sort of getting short here. He was actually concerned about the future of free market capitalism in America. The idea that its very survival was sort of being imperiled at this moment, and so he sort of looks at kind of what folks like Ralph Nader were doing, and saying that the tactics, the idea of really embracing politics and embracing Washington, and getting into that battle was something that businesses, if they didn't do that, they capitalism could go extinct here, right? So it does capture kind of the moment, that the tenor of that period.
So
go ahead.
It's one of the things that happens at this point. This is the real pivot point when companies really start influencing DC for the first time. We quote a CEO at the time, 1972, obviously not our quote. We got this from someone else. If you don't know your senators on a first name basis, you aren't doing an adequate job for your shareholders. So this sort of switch from businesses thinking that their job is to run their business and instead focusing on Washington, really at first to fight back. After Watergate, a couple things changed. One was the advent of PACs and corporate PACs. We write between 1974 and 1978, the number of corporate PACs skyrocketed from 89 to 784. And by 1976, corporate PACs are spending more money than labor PACs for the first time in history. So there's this real effort for companies to try to fight back into DC. And then we have enter Tommy Boggs. Boggs is the lobbyist we talked about in the last episode. This is Boggs, sort of the making of Tommy Boggs also, is that he kind of comes to his top of his strength during this period where companies are trying to get their groove back for the first time in 100 years. And the key focal point is what we write about here is an FTC case. So to roll back the clock on the FTC was created in 1918, I believe. It was created as a result of the trust era when Standard Oil and the Rockefellers, the railroad barons, had so much power and influence over our economy and government and society. After that, we had the progressive era. We created the Federal Trade Commission really to rein in the abuses and excesses of corporate America and protect consumers. They're the main consumer protection body of our country. And from the 1910s to the 1950s, the FTC is getting stronger and stronger and stronger, regulating all sorts of new products and industries. Then there's the point, Luke, right, in the 1960s or so, where the FTC becomes sort of flaccid. It sort of stops
Right.
regulating, stops getting involved too much
Yeah.
in the economy, and the
It's
FTC
really
sort of
become a joke, sort of in
yeah.
Washington.
And what was that joke? I was looking for it right now. That there's
The Great Lady
three
of,
there's
yeah.
three
Right.
museums on Constitution Avenue. The National Gallery of Art, the National Portrait Gallery, and the Federal Trade Commission. That's how much it had fallen out of power. Then, with the help of Ralph Nader, the FTC names as its chairman a guy named Michael Perchuk. Michael Perchuk was an incredibly powerful Democratic staffer on the Senate Commerce Committee, where he, through the Senate Commerce Committee, enacted all sorts of new business regulations on industry. Michael Perchuk becomes the chair of the FTC and really goes about revitalizing the agency in the 1970s. So you have companies who are trying to regain their influence. You have Perchuk, who's trying to reestablish the FTC as a huge regulatory body, and they basically collide in 1978 in this story we tell, led by Tommy Boggs. And that is Perchuk decides that he wants to protect children from sugared cereals. He thinks the sugared cereal industry is leading to tooth decay, and the way to crack down on sugared cereals is through advertising. At the FTC, he starts working on a regulation that would prevent television advertisers, cereal companies, and advertisers from advertising specifically to children. Luke, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was a rule that would have targeted both the bottom lines of cereal companies as well as broadcasters and advertisers that relied on advertising dollars, right? So in that moment, what becomes important is that Tommy Boggs is able to sort of create a coalition of both advertisers and food manufacturing companies. Now, this is obviously something that happens all the time in Washington today, but at that time it was very novel, right? The idea of creating a coalition and joining forces essentially, and they put together. They had a budget of something like $30 million to fight this, which was about half of the FTC's entire budget.
It's crazy.
And they really go to work on trying to water this down, and they target Perchuk specifically. Well, one of the things that they do here is it was one of the first times that, and this was Tommy Boggs' idea, was to go after the appropriations process, right? I mean, the rule.
So the idea here, I think, is that the Perchuk is creating this regulation, but it's not yet there. So they can't really. There's nothing they can't fight it. There's nothing to fight.
Yeah.
But what they realize is they can go to Congress, go to the congressional appropriations process, and cut funding. Literally ban Perchuk and the FTC from having the funds to pay the staff to create the regulation. So they're like cutting
And
the
to enforce it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's again the idea of this isn't terribly novel, but at the time it was. People hadn't looked at Washington that way, and so that's something that Boggs was able to do. Now, in terms of the actual campaign, one of the things, the thing they do that is most effective is they reach out to Greenwell.
Meg Greenfield.
Forgive me, Meg Greenfield. Then the
famous top editorial writer at the Washington Post at the time, and later, she died a few years ago, had incredible power over the Washington Post editorial decisions, and considered, like most people at the Washington Post, more of a Democrat and a liberal.
Right. And Boggs sends her material that frames what the FTC is doing here as the FTC being a national nanny, right? The idea that it's kind of getting the idea of government being too intrusive, right? Where this is really the responsibility of parents here who should be deciding what their children eat and what their children watch on television.
So the editorial is entitled "The FTC as National Nanny." She writes, So the proposal, in reality, is designed to protect children from the weakness of their parents and parents from the willing insistence of their children, the Post declared. That traditionally is one of the roles of governance. If you can afford one, it's not the proper role of the government. So there's a real shift. This editorial by the Washington Post comes out and kind of galvanizes this movement among corporate America and among really regular Americans that the government has gotten too powerful and is too involved in society and your family life. Your decision over what to feed your children is really what is at stake, according to this corporate fight at the FTC.
Right, and that slogan, "National Nanny," it discredits not only this very specific rule here, right? But it sort of discredits the whole idea of sort of activist government, right?
Absolutely.
The idea that this sort of the idea that government should be intervening and protecting consumers from the sort of excesses of corporate capitalism.
I mean, that
Yeah,
what you
that
said.
had gone too far.
Yeah, what you said is 100% right, which is exactly why we focus on this fight in this book, because this is the key pivot point. And it's not about Republicans in corporate America against Democrats and corporations. It's everyone is turning against big government at this point in the 1970s. And that's why there's a key pivot point. I want to quote from Fritz Hollings. If you ever listen to Fritz Hollings, who's sadly passed away, amazing Democratic senator from South Carolina, during the hearings over the FTC's funding, he's talking about Michael Perchuk, the head of the FTC, and he says, "It's a good thing they passed the anti-lynching laws before you got appointed," he says to Perchuk. "You're like the cross-eyed javelin thrower. You never hit anything, but you keep a lot of folks on the edge of their seats." This is from a Democrat talking about a Democratic
Consumer
regulator.
protection, effort, right? So and it's even bigger than that, Broad, right? Again, this is 1978. The economy, we've been going through this period of stagflation, right? And the whole idea we thought that we had solved all of these problems with the business cycle and things like that. And the whole idea of sort of Keynesian economics, which was, this sort of is so deeply embedded into the Democratic establishment in Washington, which was really, ruling the government, that had all fallen apart here, right? So Democrats are scared, right, that they're going to get thrown out of office. It's kind of similar to today, right, where we've got these inflationary pressures, right, and it really scrambles alliances, right? So that's some of the things that you're seeing on the Democratic side.
Also
at that
similar
time.
to today in the battle over the FTC right now, and whether it's going to regulate big companies or not. I mean, this same exact fight is playing out. I mean, one of the things I really like about going back to this book and comparing it to what's happening now is there's so many instances where history is repeating itself, and this is one of them. There are big time fights right now between corporate America and regulators about the power of the FTC and whether they're going to go after, have the influence to go after big tech companies and other industries.
So,
just
bro,
to wrap up, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was just going to say, just to wrap this up, the corporate lobby succeeds not only in preventing this regulation from becoming enacted, but they also are able to shut down through related lawsuits. Are able to the impact of related lawsuits and pressure on Congress. They're able to shut down the FTC on two separate occasions for 24 hours. They really just totally discredit this agency and what Perchuk was trying to do.
So we write, and when I say we write, this was Luke wrote, it was a watershed moment in corporate America's struggle to win power in Washington. Food producers and broadcasters hadn't just killed a regulatory proposal they didn't like. They turned the FTC's chairman into a political pariah, shut down one of Washington's oldest consumer protection agencies, and delivered a resounding message to regulators throughout the federal bureaucracy. Other agencies have not yet provoked Congress, may not want to stir the horse's net, said one consumer advocate.
Right.
At this point, also, we see the explosion of the corporate lobby that we write about. We'll get into in other episodes. And we see a shift in government at this exact point when we see fewer regulations coming out and more pro-business policies. The best example might be in Carter's tenure. He proposed a tax increase that moved its way through Congress during this time, and Congress flipped the tax proposal, and it ended up being a corporate tax cut, a capital gains tax cut that came out. So that's not even in the Reagan administration. That's late, harder. Things are switching in a markedly pro-business way.
Yeah, yeah. No, again, we in terms of the the trajectory of corporate power in America, 1978 is a huge pivot point, right? I mean, it's really the point where corporations go from being on the defensive to really being on the defense. They going from defense to offense. 1978. Now that comes to full flower, right, in the 80s. But if you look below the surface here, you're seeing it in fights like this, right?
So let's close it with this. This is the end of that chapter. As the decade drew to a close, the balance of power in Washington had inverted. Unions, consumer groups, and environmentalists no longer had the clout to drive the legislative agenda. Instead, after 50 years on the defensive, corporate power was on the march. So let's end it here. We'll come back in a few minutes with Sue Davis to talk about the current FTC battle.
This episode is brought to you by Sable Strategy. Sable is a senior-level strategic communications firm bringing decades of experience traversing and navigating some of the toughest public affairs, issues management, and corporate reputation terrains. Media relations experts and trainers, digital strategists, creative directors, advertising executives, and writers. We approach every communications challenge with grace, grit, speed, and agility, whether in Washington or another wilderness. Learn more about how we can support your public affairs needs at www.sablestrategy.com.
Hey, welcome back to the Wolves of K Street podcast. We're joined by our longtime friend, former colleague, Susan Davis, who has worked for every publication in Washington, except for the New York Times. Who you work for? USA Today, Wall Street Journal, NPR, Congress Daily.
Roll Call. Don't forget
Roll Call. Who else?
I also did the Almanac of American Politics, and I started in journalism actually at People magazine.
Whoa.
So I've covered many topics in my life.
So a topic that people would never cover is this FTC case, Humphrey's executor versus the U.S. government or versus the FTC?
It's Donald Trump, I believe, versus the one of the fired FTC commissioners whose name is escaping me right now, but you probably know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this to me is a fascinating case because it was one that I was covering when I was still reporting earlier this year. And this is one of those things that I would call a BBI when I would go to my editor. I would say, you got to let me do a story on this. It's a BBI. It's boring, but it's important. And it's one of these low-key, how the government works type cases that has the potential to really remake the way the federal government works. So let me try to explain it in as 101 as possible. About 100 years ago, FDR tried to fire a Senate-appointed commissioner because he was getting in the way of his agenda. And they said, hey, you can't do that. And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that you could not fire someone without cause. You couldn't fire someone because they weren't in line with your political agenda. And this has since then long been the bane of conservative legal theorists who would argue that the Constitution does not put many checks on the executive, over the executive branch. The president runs the executive branch. So the idea that anything can be independent of the president is unconstitutional. I would say that this had been described for a long time as a fringe legal theory, but as Trump has come back into power again, they wanted to challenge it. And so if the Supreme Court throws out this unanimous 100-year-old precedent, it really will fundamentally change the way the federal government works in terms of regulatory oversight, how laws are implemented, who decides how the laws are implemented. And I think in terms of sort of the world you guys talk about, this relationship between corporate power and Washington, which I think has been built out on a system, regardless of how you feel about it, that has been relatively stable for the past 100 years. And the processes and the rules of the game have the potential to really be upended when the court decides this next summer. And look, we should not predict what the court is going to do. We don't know, but based off of what the justices were saying in these arguments and Supreme Court reporters left, right, and center who understand the court more seem like the court sounds pretty inclined to overturn this precedent.
Yeah, and these agencies, so for our entire lives covering Washington, the way it sort of worked is there's Congress, there's the executive branch and the presidency, and there's these independent agencies, which are always a little fuzzy, like the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, which we're talking about, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Isn't it also like the Consumer Product Safety Commission and the
FTC?
It's all the alphabet soup.
It's all the C's, I say. The SEC, all the C's.
Right. Not these agencies have sort of operated. They're supposed to be independent, and they operate sort of along their separately. So when I remember writing a story for the Wall Street Journal back when you were there about a net neutrality rule that the Federal Communications Commission was coming up with, and Obama didn't like the regulation, but he felt that there was nothing he could do about it because the FCC, even though the FCC is a part of the executive branch, he felt like it was out of bounds for him to try to force the issue at all. Yeah. And he ended up having some weird issue where he had to have sort of emissaries go to the FCC to try to work on a joint proposal. But it was sort of considered like uncouth for the president to weigh in on policy coming out of his own executive branch, which does seem strange. But that's just sort of how that's been the precedent for 100 years.
And now in the potential new world, the president could just fire those people if they were issuing rules that he didn't agree with.
The president has already fired those people.
And is trying to fire a tremendous amount of people. And like, look, this is the other thing I think is really key to this. It's not happening in a vacuum, right? Like if they decide to give the president fundamentally more power, it's happening in the real world where there is also an Article I branch of government, Congress, that I think is fair to say is at one of its most legislatively weak times in modern history. Congress is not a robust check on the executive branch. Congress is not robustly legislating questions that come to these regulatory issues of the environment and technology and banks. And so if one branch of government is not functioning properly and another branch of government is willing to sort of soak up all that power, especially in the current Washington we're living in, where when one party controls all three branches, Congress has, in the modern world, become pretty deferential to their president if they're in office. They kind of do what the president says. And so that practical world we're living in, I also think amounts to a president who might pass, say, I don't like those parts of the law. I don't like how those are being implemented. Let's do the regulations the way I want to do it. Right. And so in the hands of a president who has a very strong view of executive power, like Donald Trump, you can do a tremendous amount in a 4 or 8 year term.
Yeah. And just a point on that, right?
So what's fascinating.
Oh, just a point on that, we talk a lot about, with regard to corporate power, if we will go back to a somewhat normal environment after Trump leaves, and with regard to Congress, future Congresses could be more active in the future, right? They could provide more of a check. But when you start getting when you start getting court decisions like this, right? You start to harden the sort of executive power, right? And again, those are the kind of things that make it more likely that the period we are in now, where so much power is concentrated in the executive branch, will remain going forward, right? Because Congress can change, but these cases are significant because they remain there in the
for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's like a really important point because so much of this court argument is focused on Trump. But the political irony here is if the court expands this definition of executive power, it will at some point benefit the Democratic Party. At some point in our lifetimes, Democrats are going to control the trifecta again. Mm-hmm. And you also have a Democratic Party that I think is on a trajectory to become more skeptical of corporate America, right? I think they've been burned by being seen as a party that became too cozy with business. And there is a real movement in the Democratic Party to be more aggressive towards corporate America. There's a movement in the Democratic Party where they'd like to break up some of these big companies. And again, in the not happening in a vacuum, and Bertie, you've written about this, like the Justice Department is also fundamentally different now. The Justice Department is much more politicized. The president is also weighing in on antitrust decisions, on who should be prosecuted and not prosecuted. So again, when you combine that execution of power, a weak Congress, and a potentially more legal power for the president to decide the policies and who runs the executive branch, we're in a whole new ballgame. And I think, and you're right, Luke, like Supreme Court precedents aren't short-lived. When the court overturns something that's been on the books for 95 years, it's a safe assumption that that could be the law of the land, at least for the rest of our lifetimes.
So it's funny, we were just talking in the previous segment, Luke and I were, about how history repeats itself. And going back to our last chapter, Luke and I were just talking about, we wrote, for most of American history, real power was concentrated in the hands of a select few elected officials, the president, the Senate Majority Leader, the Speaker of the House, and a small number of congressional committee chairmen. But after Watergate, lawmakers in the mid-1970s passed a series of reforms that served to decentralize this power. Among other things, the measures added a raft of new committees and subcommittees to Congress, which drastically increased the number of elected officials with meaningful authority over public policy decisions. By 1979, every Democratic senator, except for one, chaired a committee or a subcommittee. So that's how Congress has been for our entire lifetimes.
Yeah.
So many people control power. So many people have influence over legislation. And what's amazing is that Donald Trump has pulled all that power back to the White House, and this Supreme Court decision could give him even more power, making Congress even less influential going forward, which changes just how entirely how the government works.
If you also think about it too, we are also living through a time of pretty extreme polarization. There isn't much of a middle anymore, and there used to be. When those Watergate era reforms were enacted, there was a lot more conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, and that's not the same way anymore. And so part of where I think this is so interesting in how it could change government is if you have every 4 years or every 8 years parties switching power, it could also lead to a tremendous amount of chaos in government where everybody's getting wiped out, every so often. So the reliability of these agencies becomes fully weakened. And that to me almost seems baked in. If you even look at, even beyond the court case, does anybody believe that if a Democrat wins in 2028, they're going to keep Kash Patel as FBI director, even though the FBI director technically serves, I believe it's a 10-year term? 7, it's supposed to belong to it protect itself from political influence. Like, I think those days are over. So it's happening. These things are happening in all at the same time. And when you connect all of those dots, I think we are living through a government change akin to what happened during the Watergate era. But in this case, it's undoing a lot of those changes and structures and power sharing that we've lived under our whole lives.
100%. Let's wrap it up there. Sue, can you give a plug for your new business? What are you up to now?
Oh, that's great. I started my own company over the summer, and I'm doing media and communications consulting, which is basically whatever I want it to be. So I'm doing everything from corporate consulting to still doing a little bit of political podcast hosting to doing writing, a little bit of crisis because, there's lots of crisis going on all over, and basically just having a lot of fun. So I'm really enjoying it. And this was a lot of fun. I'm excited to see you become media moguls.
And give us your website.
It's SJD Strategies, and I'm very easy to reach.
Awesome.
Right.
Thanks so much for joining us. Fascinating conversation. Luke and I will be back in a minute.
Thanks, Sue.
You're welcome.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Alzheimer's Association. Congress can connect Americans to Alzheimer's solutions, scientists and patients to dementia research, and Americans to early and accurate dementia diagnosis. Let's pursue our vision of a world without Alzheimer's and all other dementia as we accelerate progress beyond where we stand today. Congress, it's up to you. Learn more at alz.org/congressconnects.
Welcome back to Wolves of K Street podcast. Luke, what do you think of what Sue had to say?
Yeah, exactly. I think she's right on the money. We went through this period of decentralization of power, after Watergate in the 70s, and the whole idea was designed to spread power around so that it couldn't be abused. And we're seeing the opposite happen, right? Where we're seeing power being centralized, in the executive branch, right? And the makeup of Congress can change. Supreme Court justices, the makeup of the court changes. But once you have these, again, assuming the decision goes the way we think it will, when you have these cases, these Supreme Court decisions, those are the kind of things that really set the boundaries for generations afterwards. So if this goes the way that it's looking like it's going to, it's going to be a really significant development.
Yeah, 100%. There's so many things that are unfolding right before our eyes in Washington in terms of how power has changed, and this is just a major one. I think you and Sue made a great point that this doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that these are legal precedents that will stand forever. I hadn't quite thought of that until you guys mentioned it. That this court case, and Sue said, "Don't make any predictions." Well, let's make a prediction. This is going to happen. I mean, the conservative Republican appointed Supreme Court justices there were really in their public comments and questions disparaging the idea that there could be independent regulators,
Right.
independent of the presidency. They really were saying, as they've said for 20 years, that the president should be in charge of his or her administration, Republican or Democratic. So, I mean, they will almost certainly, I would be shocked if they didn't strike this down. And that'll be permanent. I mean, another huge change in how Washington operates under Donald Trump. Luke, any final thoughts, or you want to end it there?
Yeah, just one final thought is, the theory behind all of this is that the way government has been functioning, where with decentralized power, has not been delivering for the American people and lawmakers' constituents, right? And, that's a hard argument to argue against, right? So that's kind of the backdrop here. But, I think Brody's 100% right. We should expect the ruling to go the way that we think it's going to, and they will be hugely significant.
Awesome. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Wolves of K Street podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.